Hello and welcome back, everyone. This is the second academic preview paper session for the AI and Policy Conference. I'm happy to introduce another round of esteemed scholars who later this evening will be presenting their research in technical detail and with feedback from other academics. But for now, we have shorter presentations for the broader conference. And before we get to that, I'd like to you can see everyone's pictures here, but you'll see them in a second. But I wanted to just share my screen quickly and show you what we're doing later, and provide some summary of the academic paper session later. So as you might have already seen, we have a session C and a session D. Session C is on regulatory issues in AI, and session D is on technical aspects of AI. I'm going to put the link to this document into the chat in case you want to go and look at it. The first session, Eileen Nielsen from ETH Zurich will be chairing. I'll be chairing the second session. In the first session, we have Eileen Nielsen, who can't join today because of a time zone issue. She's in the US. But she'll be presenting accuracy bounding, a regulatory path forward for the algorithmic society. So you'll get to see that if you join this session. Second, we have Jacob Slosser from University of Copenhagen to present what's in the box, the legal requirement of explainability and computationally aided decision-making in public administration. Third, we have Michael Weiser from University of St. Gallen to present AI initiatives in Swiss enterprises, governance mechanisms to increase transparency and fairness. So this group of presentations will be on the regulatory issues in artificial intelligence. The second session, which I'll be chairing, we'll start with Wendy K. Tam Cho from University of Illinois on a parallel evolutionary multiple tribe metropolis Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithm for sampling spatial partitions. Second, Carmela Troncoso from Lausanne will present POTs, or protective optimization technologies. Third, Christian Arnold from Cardiff University will, along with Marcel Neunhoeffer, will present really useful data, a framework to evaluate the quality of differentially private synthetic data. So I hope you're excited as I am to see all of these, but to get a taste of it, we'll give a short preview of all of them. And so to start off, we'll start off with Carmela Troncoso from EPFL to present a few slides about POTs. Welcome, Carmela. Arvin, are you able to skip to her slides?
Thank you. Thank you, Elliott, and I'm very happy to be here. So what I want to talk about are that in general, when we think about AI systems, we always think about people interacting with the AI system, and then there is kind of some bad effect, these people, and then we need some governance to avoid the bad effect. But this considers a very simple pipeline. AI is not always this kind of box with an input and an output. In general, we see AI more and more used as input to optimization algorithms in which companies or institutions use data to influence how users act, what users do. And in general, AI framework, governance frameworks don't take into account these things. So in my presentation, I want to go a little more in depth about what these optimization systems mean. Arvind, if you're going to move to the next slide. And then I will argue that we not only need the kind of technologies that we have thinking nowadays to support governance framework, but we need other technologies that we call protective optimization technologies to account for more things that maybe should be governed, that is not only AI and is not only from the point of view of the data owner. So I want to kind of put a bit of a thought into your heads that maybe AI governance should be broader and a bit different from what we're thinking today. And I hope this is enough of a teaser so that I will see you this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carmela. So we'll have time for some discussion at the end, but for now we'll go to the second presentation by Jacob Slosser from University of Copenhagen.
Hi. I'll try to be as brief as that. That was really laudable. I don't think it's in my nature to be able to be that brief, but I'll give it a go.
We have 5 to 6 minutes for a presentation, so
okay.
With gratitude to Carmela for being brief, there's no requirement.
All right, fair enough. So yeah, we focus in our paper on a very specific kind of problem within AI governance, which is called the black box problem, which I'm sure everyone is familiar. The idea that when some kind of algorithmic decision-making system comes to some sort of conclusions, depending on what kind of machine learning mechanisms you've used, sometimes the inner workings of that machine can be opaque and undecipherable of why a system did what it did, why didn't it do something else, when can you trust that system, and how can I fix it if there's problems? And these questions lead to a number of fears, and often these fears are responded to through ethical guidelines versus maybe some hardcore legal analysis, which would have helped understand what it means when we want a system to be explainable. And maybe you can jump to the next slide here. There's been a number of kind of ideas of what explanation means. And so in the paper, we go into a legal analysis, and we'll talk a little bit about it in the presentation later, about what it means to want some kind of explanation. There's different kinds of things, frameworks throughout Europe, kind of varying from a right to an hardcore right to an explanation, or maybe just some kind of having the logic of the decisions or what might be meaningful in the decision, or full transparency in the system itself. But we think that the legal idea behind explainability is really to just ensure better clarification of decisions, to have some kind of control of decision makers. And really, it's this kind of last point on this slide of that it's really about legal remedy and recourse, that if a decision's made against you and someone's explained why they've made this decision, then really the point of having the explanation is so you can fight it if you disagree. And in this way, we think that explanation is not any different because it's algorithmic. You know, if you were in front of a caseworker and they made a decision about you, it makes no sense to talk about it. Well, you know, what kind of childhood did this caseworker have, and do they not like the kind of shoes I'm wearing, right? All the things that may have rolled into why a decision was made aren't legally relevant, and those wouldn't be given as an explanation, and you wouldn't really want it as an explanation. We feel the similar kind of logic of a decision making is true of most ADM systems. And we can hop to the next slide. Given all that, we still have this giant spectrum of ways that these can be employed. So in the paper, we focus on a particular scenario, which is kind of, on one side of this spectrum, you might have a purely human system where you have a human, say, caseworker and a human appeals board, and it's human all the way through. And on the other side, you might have a fully automated system, which I think a lot of people's fear is really about this kind of situation. So we kind of focus on a hybrid model that sits somewhere in the middle. And this is, could be either human at the front line gathering the data and making a decision with some kind of automated appeals-based system, or vice versa, some kind of automated system and then some kind of human appeals board system. Our point is to try to unpack the idea of what it means to have a human in the loop, which is probably the vaguest call for regulation that we can think of not knowing where to put that, how to put that, and having no guidance on how it might fit into a system. So next slide, please. So we try to provide a specific human in the loop model, and the goal is to set the threshold at what we call the human-centric standard. I mean, many ethical guidelines always called for a human-centric model, and we really think this means saying that an algorithm has a threshold to pass, and that's the legal regulations we have governing humans right now, and it doesn't need to be any higher. And it's actually a burden to try to make it higher, and we think it's perfectly reasonable to figure this out that way. And you go to the next slide here. So we proposed one specific kind of system, and we named it this administrative Turing test, which we even have a little bit of an eye roll about. But the idea is that we develop a system where a human might not be able to tell the difference between an explanation of a human and a machine. And this might be a decent threshold to use. I'll explain more of what we mean by that in the session later.
Thank you, Jacob. Looking forward to seeing the rest of that. So now we have Wendy Tam to present. Wendy, are you there?
Yep,
Hello.
I'm here. Hey, I'm going to share my screen. And I think you can see this.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about an actual algorithm that we've been working on for a number of years to study redistricting in the United States. So I'll present a fairly, basic introduction to redistricting, which is basically separating voters into districts, electoral districts like this. And I'll discuss our approach to it, that it's basically an algorithmic approach to the spatial partitioning problem. So this is just a picture of the kinds of units that we would use to create districts, and then how we would develop a computational algorithm to create those districts and then to characterize them. So it has a couple of different applications. One is in partisan gerrymandering, which has been a big thing in the United States. And that was the legal definition of a partisan gerrymander that I was showing you. And I analogize it to this idea of an apple. If you have an apple, how would you decide if it was excessively red or not? And the basic approach is basically that I create these distributions. So the idea is, if you can create a distribution of where apples or maps are, then you can decide if something is extreme on that. That would be extreme. This would not be extreme. And usually what happens in court is something like this, where one side brings in this distribution and says it's the distribution of all of the apples or maps, and the other side brings in another one, and the judge has no idea if either of these are actually representative of what they want to see. And so what we want to do is basically build the correct distribution for legal cases. To do that, we have an optimization algorithm that I'll talk about that basically builds maps. So I'll talk about that later. And then we also have this other aspect of it where we employ a supercomputer, specifically the one at Illinois called the Blue Waters supercomputer. And that's a picture of it there. It's got 750,000 processor cores and runs at sustained petascale computing. So this is actually an old supercomputer now, but still in existence. The fastest ones now are quite a bit faster, but I'll talk a little bit about that and how we actually use it to build the maps. And then I'll talk about how, after we recreate all these things, how we manage to make it into a sample, as opposed to just a process where we're just creating maps. We actually can have certain properties for these maps or understand them in a certain way, that it's an actual sample. And then I will end by talking about reform, and basically the idea of, when you build algorithms like this, when you build things that are maybe non-transparent to other people, how do you use these kinds of things to influence policy? How should they be used? How should they not be used? So maybe touching a little bit on the previous presenters, ideas about transparency. Maybe you'll tell me this isn't transparent at all, but that's the idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Looking forward to discussing that further later on. So now we have Michael Weiser from University of St. Gallen.
Hi, so can you already hear me?
Hi, Michael, yes.
Perfect. So thanks for the invitation, first of all, and I hope you all had a great conference so far. So I'm Michael from the University of St. Gallen, and today, later in the academic session, I will present together with my colleague Miles Schneck our preliminary findings on our ongoing study on AI governance initiatives in Swiss enterprises. So if you could go on the next slide, what we are actually doing is you can look at AI governance from different perspectives, of course. So, for example, the policy perspective, which would be, for example, who should actually regulate AI, or the organizational perspective. So who should be responsible and accountable for what exactly in the organization itself, or the individual perspective where we deal with problems, for example, how to increase the perceived fairness of AI systems. And we have seen that most of the academic and public conversations mostly centers on AI policy, which is tremendously important because it provides the entire framework for the organizational governance. But we want to focus in our research, especially as we come from the performance management discipline, on actually how to kind of translate then these policy mechanisms into the company, and really to get guidance for managers on how to govern AI. So our big question is really how to ensure this fairness and transparency from a corporate perspective, and to break it down to the organizational level. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Just quickly, our research is part of a larger interdisciplinary project together with the ETH Zurich at the University of Zurich, which is funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. And there our overall goal is to develop an AI governance framework, where we see that to have actually an efficient or effective solution for this, we need this interdisciplinary approach. And in this, we are focusing on this organizational perspective. So as you can see here, for example, we're dealing with the questions of, in the end, who should be responsible for ensuring fairness and transparency within the system? So should it rather be the IT, or is it actually a third control instance like an AI audit team? Or is it actually the user who is using the system? Should there be, and how could emergency protocols look like if we detect bias in the system and the system is already in production? And these are the things we are dealing in this project. And now if we go to the next slide, this evening we will present kind of the first part of our path on this way, and the preliminary results from an exploratory study on this governance initiatives in large Swiss enterprises. And they will really try to understand what are actually currently governance mechanisms that Swiss enterprises already have in place to increase transparency and fairness. So what they're actually already doing, and this is the first step for us then to develop really guidance for managers on best practices and on prescriptive practices for AI governance. And we found in our preliminary results that on the one hand, only a few really AI-specific governance mechanisms have been implemented yet. So, for example, AI audit teams. And there's still quite a debate whether existing mechanisms might actually be fit and proper to deal with these ethical challenges. And these are, for example, ethics committees or the code of conduct, which companies have in place. And some of them find them actually also still useful and applicable also for the age of AI. And also we find this call for regulation the companies call for this regulation from regulator on the one hand to reduce their uncertainties, of course, but also to better distinguish on what will actually be regulated and which areas not. So, for example, will experimentation with these algorithms also be regulated or not? And this seems to be quite a big issue and uncertainty currently. So we're very interested also for your input and for your expertise. So we're looking forward to maybe seeing you in the evening are also hearing from you, and because we're still, it's an ongoing survey, and we're still looking forward to hear from your expertise, and also to kind of get some tweaks right, because we still have some contradictions also in the data. And so we would be really happy to get in touch. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Michael. We got a couple of questions for that, but we'll save those for the end discussion. For now, we'll go forward to Chris Arnold to talk about synthetic data.
Sorry, yeah, this is so this is joint work with Marcel, who is also in the call. I'll be kicking off this teaser presentation, and Marcel will then take off later tonight. And there we go. Hope you can see the our presentation. Exactly, beautiful. So if we go to the first slide, what we see is the use case that is pretty straightforward, and that probably lots of people are familiar with here in this context. Imagine you have sensitive data and you want to share it. How can you do that? And this might be really relevant for scientists who want to share sensitive data and want that other scientists are capable of reanalyzing that data. It might be that you're a government and you want to make sure that others can reproduce your studies. Or you could be a business, own data, and you want to externalize services. So the use cases are really pretty straightforward here. If we go to the next slide, what we can see is that there are two core insights that are important. So the first insight is, well, maybe you don't want to share the actual data. You just want to share the statistical information that is in that data. And something a lot of people have been working on is the concept of synthetic data. And synthetic data is basically a synthetic copy of your original data. And what you can do with that is you can use it to analyze this synthetic data, just as you would analyze the original data. You come to the same conclusions because it still contains all necessary information, all the core information that's in the original data. The second insight then is, yeah, okay, so this offers me a first layer of protection here in this data, and in terms of privacy protection. But imagine if you had somebody like Bill Gates in your data, who is a very strong outlier in income. This outlier in the data will translate into your synthetic data copy. So what you need is a principled way of protecting the privacy that you have in this data. And the fusion of both worlds, so synthetic data together with principled data, will and principled data protection mechanism will give you something like, next slide please, differentially private synthetic data. And this allows to protect privacy with principled guarantees, because this is what all this concept of differential privacy has been built around. But at the same time, you can still work with it in a way that you can. So the big question is, can you work with that data actually? Because making synthetic data differentially private means adding noise to this whole data. So the question is, what is data utility? And data utility, and you can see that on the next slide, is an inherently subjective concept, of course. It really depends on what you actually want to do with that data. The use case already described a couple of scenarios that are really typical for most applications. You have somebody who owns sensitive data, and you have other people who want to share data. So what Marcel and I have been developing is a benchmark that helps you pick the best algorithm to release differentially private synthetic data. You can see the framework on the next slide, and we're happy to go in depth in the presentation tonight. It's basically a distinction between training data similarity and generalization similarity on the one hand. So how similar is your synthetic data to the training data? Or how similar is your synthetic data to a population out there that you don't know? So this is example like in election forecasting, where you just have one sample of the data and you want to find out what the population actually thinks. And you can then measure utility in two ways, in sort of specific utility, that means analyzing data, doing predictions, or general utility, this is your overall distributions of your data. So once you have that and you add a couple of measures, you can visualize the results of your algorithm that generates differentially private synthetic data. And the next slide gives a good overview on how that probably could look like. So this is us training a generative adversarial net and using gradient clipping to ensure differential privacy here. And this is one example in how you can visualize that. And you can then, with this measurement framework, compare different algorithms and really pick the one that really suits what you're actually interested in. So if you want to know more about that, obviously there is a working paper. We will be tonight at the presentation, and we are really interested in all kinds of applications, be it government applications, business applications. There is, of course, a debate about startups you could have around issues on synthetic data. This is a really cool thing. We're looking forward to any kind of questions and anybody who wants to know more about our project.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Marcel. So we have a few minutes left for questions. I have a couple, and we got one from the audience. So let's start with that. Aisha asks has a question for Michael. How many players have you talked to for this study? What is your experience in large companies versus SMEs in Switzerland? And what are the next steps that you envision?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. And I probably answer it together with the other question which Anna posted, yes, and also which research methods we used and how large our sample was, because it's quite interrelated. So as I mentioned, these are our preliminary findings. So this is really very, very early stage research. So for this, we currently we had 10 in-depth qualitative interviews with 4 large-sized Swiss companies. So from the financial service industry, from transportation industry, and also from the ICT industry. And all these companies were just for size, or we're only focusing on large companies, which means, for example, in this case of more than 25,000 employees. And the thing is why, and this is for your question, Aisha, on our experience between SMEs and large companies, we actually just focus on large companies because we have seen that hardly any companies, and especially SMEs, are beyond the real experimentation phase of AI systems, especially for management support systems. And this is what we're specifically looking at in this research and in this paper. So I actually cannot really answer your question on these differences, unfortunately. But maybe also then from the sampling technique. So we applied purposeful sampling. So we approached companies where we know they're already applying these AI systems in management support. So for example, for sales forecasting system, for HR decisions and so forth. And then we had talks to, on the one hand, to developers of these systems. So, for example, data scientists, but also from the manager perspective, from head of AIs, from the head of data governance, to get those findings yet. But we had there was also, I think, the question regarding the triangulation. So yet the data is uncoded yet. What we did so far is we did this preliminary analysis because we're planning a ground theory approach in the end. We're planning data triangulation, of course, researcher triangulation with the coding, but also data triangulation by further adding archival data. So the entire code of conduct and the reports from ethical from ethic committees and so on. But this hasn't been done yet. So I hope the could answer your questions, but I'm happy to answer any further.
There can be further discussion at the longer previews this evening. Thank you. So I had a couple of more questions for the other panelists, and there's also room to ask more questions in the chat. Jacob, can I ask, your paper, or the title, was pitched as being about explanation, but towards the end you were discussing this administrative Turing test. Can I ask what role will explanations play in that part? Because it feels like human explanations differ from machine explanations more so than human decisions would differ from machine decisions. Sure,
I think it's a fair point. I think the distinction that we come to is that even if the explanations might differ in substance legally, they shouldn't have to. That when a caseworker, say, gives an explanation, you're often getting, and we're speaking in a very kind of administrative kind of context, just for example.
So it would be like pointing to a specific statutory section, for example.
Yeah, they would say, we have case law that says we make a decision classifying your illness, say you're applying for a welfare benefit, your illness as serious or not serious. And here is the list of things that we count as serious. Here's the list of things that we don't count as serious. You fall into category A or category B. And here's why we have the right to do that. And that's basically the explanation you get. You don't get this long explanation about all the things that they considered and what you could have done differently. And that's not required. Now, in a perfect world, it might be nice if we require some of that, but it also puts, I think, an unnecessary burden on, say, caseworkers, and it opens them up to certain kinds of liability. I mean, offhand, I kind of think of the laws they've passed for doctors, for instance, on the I'm sorry laws that basically allow them to apologize for mistakes they make without opening themselves up to liability. So there's other reasons why we don't want thick explanations. And the idea of the Turing test is to kind of say, well, if we can't tell the difference between a human and a machine in the explanation it's given, isn't that the bar we should use?
Right. Thank you.
Yep.
I have one more question for Wendy. I think this system of presenting outliers in the distribution is a very interesting and exciting approach. Can I ask, from your personal experience or from what you've heard, or what are your thoughts about how difficult is this to explain to human judges? And perhaps not even judges, but policymakers or politicians. And have you seen, or do you have an idea of what arguments would opposition expert witnesses have against it?
Yeah, I've done a good amount of legal work. And so I've worked with lawyers pretty extensively on explaining the concepts. And I think we have a pretty good way to explain it. I think it's explainable and easy enough to understand. For the court cases, we've also in the past given out the code. And I don't know if that's helpful or not. I know people say, okay, if you want transparency, you got to see the whole thing. But when they get the whole thing, they're like, okay, what am I supposed to do with this? Because, it's like 10,000 lines of code. So, I don't know if that really qualifies as transparency for people or not. They like to have it and know it exists. But really, it's the idea of having, we actually have a lot of publications on this, about a dozen of them now. So it's completely transparent in that way. And I don't really know how we approach this issue of, everybody has got to understand it, because it's just not easy to understand. You can read all the papers or you cannot, but if you're going to, it's not a small endeavor. So I don't really know how to get around that, but it is, the ideas and the intuition itself are completely explainable.
And do you know what, or do you have an idea of what arguments can be used against it by expert witnesses who are defending gerrymandered districts?
Yeah, I'm pretty familiar with those. I don't think they really work. We can kind of get that into that in a longer session, but
Sure. Very good. We can go longer on that later. There actually was another just short chat request, Wendy, for if you can share your slides if they're public.
Oh, you want the slides again?
Do you have a public link to them?
It's the link that I sent you.
Okay, great. I'll post that in the chat in a moment then.
Okay.
In the meantime, so we're close to 5:30, so I would say we should just wrap up the official session. I actually have a few more questions, and we have another 15 minutes for the next before the next session. So anyone out there who has some questions, feel free to just stick around in this room to ask questions of the academic panel. But if anyone wants to take a coffee break or any other kind of break, please feel free to do so. And we'll have the final panel starting at 5:45 p.m. And on behalf of the organizers, I want to thank all of the presenters for joining this afternoon to preview their work. So as I mentioned at the top, we're going to have more in-depth discussions later this evening. I'll repaste the link in case anyone is interested. It has separate Zoom links for the two sessions in that document. Great. Okay, Michael, I had another question for you, if you have a minute.
Yeah, sure.
This, I guess, like just issues facing Switzerland and in AI regulation. Do you have an idea or about the importance of competition and monopoly or collusion? Is that an important issue, or is that more of an issue in kind of like social networks, social media, not as much in AI specifically?
Okay, we haven't actually looked at this specific aspect. So could I just ask you back on what's your idea on the impact of, or how competition would impact AI governance strategies? Do you mean in the sense of that it would probably, if you have very strict budgets, that or if you're in a very competitive setting, you would probably not take care so much about it?
The fact that Google controls TensorFlow, for example.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So actually, we haven't yet looked at it. So competition was absolutely, to be honest, absolutely not on our map so far. But we'll definitely note it down and have a look at it. But unfortunately, no, I don't have an answer on that. So.
In Switzerland, it might not be an issue, right? Just because there's it's more of like many smaller companies, right?
Yeah, it's. I mean, you could also have the thing. I mean, we're also talking to like definitely one company which has the monopoly, at least in Switzerland. I mean, it's not global, kind of these global monopolies, but still country-wise monopolies. We're speaking definitely, and that's why your question is also interesting, because one company definitely has even a regulated monopoly, and for the other ones, they're at least in markets where I would say there's an oligopoly competition likewise.
Yeah.
This could be, for example, we're maybe also starting to speak to the big banks, but it's definitely rather a competitive market. So for the other two companies, they're acting in completely free markets and competitive markets.
Great, I see.
But thanks for the input.
Sure. Are there any other questions? Also, I should have done this earlier. I invite the panelists to ask each other questions if you have comments on one of the other talks, because you might, if you're in a different session, you might not be able to see the full presentation later.
Oh, sorry for that. No, I'm just curious. This is your paper is really at a very interesting intersection. And having worked a bit in the industry myself, and in particular together with lawyers, all these ideas about explaining what AIs do and really looking into it. This is really challenging, of course, right? And yeah, against that backdrop, is this idea rooted in some practical experience of yours? Because what you're basically doing is you're sort of replacing some kind of process legitimacy with an output legitimacy. So I think this whole topic and your approach with this administrative Turing test, I think that's yeah, this could be interesting to follow and think through in a more systematic way. I mean, for me, because I've only coming across that now, but is this really rooted in some kind of experience and actually working with people in this area?
So it's a little yes and a little no. I mean, it's so basically we take the kind of stance of trying to be good scientists into saying we think this model will work, and then the next bit is we are doing a couple case studies to see if perhaps it will work if we do that kind of thing. So and then, but that's, you know, it is informed by, we work with a couple of different computer scientists who work in different municipalities, and so they have informal data that we think this should be a decent model. But I think the bigger idea for us is we're trying to kind of stage a bit of an intervention on, you know, having all these different kinds of regulations where we don't really think they're needed. In you know, sometimes they're spurred on by a bit of a reaction that we don't feel is necessary just because it happens to be a machine. So it's a bit of yes and a bit of no, I think is the best way I can answer that. Cool.
Jacob, I had another thought that I wonder if it occurred to your group, is how you know, judicial opinions are explanations in some sense. Like the you know, what you're doing from in terms of like the legal applications of what you're doing. I think there is at some point when, you know, model explanations get good enough, it's going to be like a judicial opinion where, like, you know, they're explaining the decision and articulating the different, you know, contextualizing the predictors. That's, you know, what judicial opinions are doing. And I don't know if that's part of the research project, maybe in the longer term.
Yeah, I mean, it is. So like we basically have two different projects. One is where this one strictly comes out of, is more kind of about this more administrative decision making than it would be any kind of judicial decision making. And then I have a separate project where I'm working on the you know, how the framing of different judgments, the linguistic framing of different judgments, and different ways you explain things, particularly when it comes to AI, how that changes the way people feel about it, the way they think it's legitimate, all those kinds of issues. So it's so I mean, I agree in the sense of, I think it's a model, once an AI system got good enough to give full decisions, I think our model would hold true of that we'd want the threshold at, can you tell the difference? You know, I mean, I think that would make a lot of sense. It's a I think ethically silly reason, but a legally and practically good one. You know, we have a hard time with the, you know, with the legal philosophers in our department to justify ourselves, and I think they're totally right. But it doesn't, you know, we don't have that. We have a more practical kind of approach to it.
Yeah, I actually was just listening to a talk by what was the guy's name? Albert Meyer from Utrecht about this. I mean, one of the things I really worry about is whenever you set the bar at like some kind of Turing test, then you're just begging people like who are good at advertising and self-flattery and whatever to game the system such that they convince a sufficient number of people or a sufficient importantly person or whatever, depending if you're on autocracy or something, that this is good. Yeah, that this is achieving whatever their goals, or at least convince them to say that it's achieving all the goals. And so that's why what we really, really need is, you know, democratic oversight and legitimacy. And that stuff is kept track by not looking at only outcomes, but also looking at process. So the Utrecht crowd apparently have been innovating some language around this where they say that you need input legitimacy, output legitimacy, and throughput legitimacy. So it's not, again, it's not that you can't use deep learning and you have to micromanage every like weight, but that people need to be able to examine what was the process by which you constructed, what is the entire flow by which the you know, the judgment in this case is achieved.
Yeah, I mean, can I respond to that? Just because I think, you know, I mean, while I feel really sympathetic to that view, and I think intuition-wise, I think I agree a bit. But then you know, my starting question is always, well, what really changes here? And I alluded to it in the short teaser, but we don't require that out of humans now, and we think the system is perfectly legitimate. We can game the system now with human interaction. People do it all the time.
Yeah.
I think we end up getting to this kind of nirvana fallacy of just like, why are we setting the bar so high for when there's other benefits that, you know, that we could change something countrywide, you know, countrywide, if say you had all ADM systems versus say caseworkers. There's huge bad downsides to that, of course there are, but some of the upsides of the equality of treatment, of being able to treat like cases alike and not have to be based on
treatment. No, the problem isn't that. I see what you're saying, and I understand the intuition, and I was there too. I mean, this is like, you know, full-time job, you know, hitting these things all the time. There's two forms of reasoning about that. One is we say, oh, you know, with humans, we don't have, it's true, we don't have the excess, and some of them are actually psychopathological and do really devious things. But in general, with humans, we do have a lot of intuitions about what they will and won't do, and we have means of trying to judge them in courts. And we cannot use those same means against an artifact. An artifact can be manipulated in ways that we can't even conceive of manipulating each other. It's just like off the charts of all the things we can do. So that's one thing. First of all, it is that this kind of reasoning is just fallacious because we take so much for granted because we've only dealt with humans before. But the second thing is that when the state comes into something, so when it's a private individual doing something, then the standards are never as high as it is when the state enters into it. You just do have more things you have to achieve. And the go-to example for this is adoption. The requirements of being an adoptive parent are far, far higher than for being a natural parent. And still there, unfortunately, is more abuse in those cases, right? So the point is that it's not that it's going to be exactly the same. Again, I don't want to anthropomorphize there either. But the point is that when the state enters in, then you do have a higher standard, which should be achievable. And I do agree with you. If there's something, it's like the vaccine. If there's some urgent thing, and it is a disaster right now. There's a lot of people without access to justice. You could imagine bringing in a system that is not fully legitimate, as all of our systems are to some extent not fully legitimate now, as you were just saying. But the advantage with AI is that you do have that possibility to continue improving it. And that's why I don't like to have these fallacious metaphors to the humans, because that allows people off the hook from doing an ever improving job. Anyway, I was blown away by what they're doing in Utrecht. So I just would recommend going and seeing those groups, because I'm not a lawyer.
But I think from the perspective of what a judge is doing, I mean, you might observe the inputs, some of the inputs in terms of like the briefs that they are reading and the oral arguments, but you can't get, I think this is what you kind of throughput legitimacy, because you don't know what's going on in the judge's head. And so, you know, what they write down in their opinions, you know, could be manipulated in many ways that I mean, to some extent, because they're humans, we can empathize with them. I think maybe that's what you were referring to. And so sort of like there's kind of some bounds on the manipulation that can go on. But at least with the algorithms, that would be boundless, but also there's technologies for, you know, understanding what
exactly. So that's my point. Yes, you do have, so that's exactly what I was trying to say. you do have a bad intuition. So by and large, I mean, people, again, who are legal experts can see whether the legal reasoning that the judge writes down, whether or not that's how the judge actually arrived at that decision, it is the legitimacy. It is the thing that you hold up in court and say, that was the decision that was taken, right? So that the argument is more important than what actually happened in the head to some extent.
But if you think about, like, let's say like the Federalist Society, or sort of like these kind of externalized organizations, I mean, arguably, and they're determining the judicial decisions, arguably they're closer to algorithms than human beings in terms of how we should, you know, treat them or
I totally agree with that too. Yeah, well, that's one of my, in fact, my first ever legal paper was this one about the legal lacuna of fully synthetic agents. And one of the points that we make is that we actually use the case of AI to push back on the overextension of legal personality that's been happening since the 1990s. So
Yeah.
we're saying like, no, this is like, it's not that we should follow the momentum and then go even further. Rather, we should look at all the hazards they introduced, and then say, well, geez, actually, we're sort of already facing these hazards. But
the
a
same
bunch
argument
of
that you were making about, AI we shouldn't have this kind of false comparison with humans between AI. We shouldn't have a false comparison with humans and corporations.
Right. Well, to some extent, a very small corporation, which really is a confederation of people, and to have a stake in it, it actually makes sense. But the point is that you can disintermediate and diffuse responsibility to such an extent that AI is a reasonable metaphor for what's going on there. But again, a well-run corporation. I was just last night. Every night it's another one of these, right? Last night I was just in a meeting where there was a breakout which I joined, even though I know anything about it, about C-suites. And it's really interesting listening to those people, the people on the boards talking about, because they're worried about their liability. And when they're talking about, accountability and documentation and stuff, it's really, they have such a different angle on it.